Welcome to a new deep dive. We're diving straight into one of archaeology's really big ones, the famous collapse of the classic Maya civilization.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
And we're unpacking the sources you've shared, pulling out the key insights, especially, drawing from that fantastic work by Lizzie Wade. Now, the image most of us have is pretty dramatic, right? The sort of mysterious, frightening event where millions of people supposedly just vanished.
Yeah, vanished from their cities during a massive drought. It's this picture of history just stopping.
Which honestly sounds terrifying.
And that dramatic collapse, well, it is certainly a powerful story, but what the sources we're looking at really emphasize is that archaeologists find the most profound lessons not just in the collapse itself, but in what happened after.
Right, how people dealt with it.
Exactly. It's about how people reacted, how they transformed, how they, reinvented their world. Think of apocalypse less as a final ending and more like a rapid collective loss that fundamentally changes a society's way of life and even its sense of identity.
Okay, so our mission today is to pull out the essential nuggets from these sources about that classic Maya collapse, yes, but maybe even more importantly, the surprising story of resilience and adaptation that came next.
Uh-huh.
And we're going to use the specific story of the site of Ake as our primary case study for this transformation. Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay, let's start by setting the scene at Ake itself. It's on the Yucatan Peninsula. The sources paint this picture of driving in a narrow one-lane road cutting through this really lush green forest, almost like a tunnel.
Wow.
And what's striking right away is how integrated the ancient past is with the modern present. You hear about a pyramid sitting right near first base on the community baseball field.
No way, really.
Yeah, and the main pyramid at the restored archaeological site, it has these really unique, massive columns on top. Very different from many other Maya sites. And much of what we'll discuss about Ake comes from the work of archaeologist Roberto Rosado Ramirez. He spent like 2 decades digging into its story.
20 years. Okay. And according to the sources, Ake's history, well, it's a long one. Those huge, imposing stones on the main pyramid. Some early construction dates back as far as 100 BCE.
That's far back.
Yeah. Then a full city grew up between 300 and 600 CE. Ake really hit its stride, its height, sometime between 600 and 1100 CE. The sources estimate a population around 19,000 people then.
19,000, that's a proper city.
Definitely. Now, classic Ake, during that prosperous period, it wasn't isolated at all. It was deeply connected. Extensive trade, diplomatic networks, the whole thing.
Right.
The city's main plaza, the sources note, was meticulously clean. The center of everything from bustling market days to elaborate religious festivals.
The heart of the city.
Exactly. Society was hierarchical. You had these divine monarchs ruling, believed to be essential for maintaining cosmic and social order through rituals, diplomacy. Merchants were powerful too, kind of vying with nobility, facilitating that long-distance trade. People could generally move pretty freely within this system. But, as the sources highlight, this very structure, this highly stratified, interconnected system, well, that's what started to unravel when the apocalypse began rippling up from the south.
Yeah, that initial ripple, according to the sources, started way down in what's now the Petexpetun region of Guatemala. That's like 300 miles south of Ake.
Okay.
This was in the mid to late 700s, and it happened fast.
Right.
Cities and towns there didn't just decline, they literally transformed themselves into walled fortresses almost overnight.
Overnight. Wow.
Yeah, excavations found clear evidence of intense warfare, even between close relatives, like family against family.
That's brutal.
It is. Now, what's really intriguing, and a bit of a mystery the sources point to, is the cause of this initial conflict in the south. The region had plenty of water then, there was no obvious environmental challenge at that moment, and no evidence of, say, a foreign invasion mentioned.
Wait, hang on. So the collapse didn't start with the famous drought. It started with internal conflict, warfare, even family fighting family. And the reason for that initial explosion of violence isn't clearly defined.
Exactly.
That feels like a really big shift from the simple drought caused everything narrative we usually hear. Did the sources offer any other theories about why that simmering tension might have suddenly boiled over right then in the south?
That's precisely the mystery the sources highlight. It really challenges that easy explanation. They suggest perhaps it was just the low-level political tension typical between competing city-states finally reaching a breaking point.
Just boiling over.
Yeah, escalating beyond diplomacy and maybe more ritualized warfare into something far more destructive. But regardless of the precise spark, by 830 CE, all the cities in that southern region had dramatically collapsed. Their leaders were killed or had fled, leaving the urban centers basically empty of their ruling class.
In this localized apocalypse, it didn't stay localized, did it?
No, not at all.
Hmm.
Over the next century, it slowly but surely spread north, affecting powerful, really well-known cities like Tikal and Calakmul. They started falling too.
Right, those are huge names in Maya history.
Absolutely, and this is where the drought does become a major player, fitting that classic apocalypse pattern people often think of.
Okay, so the drag comes in later.
Yes. While the initial conflict in the south might not have been directly environmental, paleoclimate evidence, scientific data about past climates from things like lake sediments or cave formations.
Right, like from Lake Chichenkanab.
Exactly. That work from the 1990s and other records confirm that a severe drought did hit these southern cities hard in the 9th century. So this prolonged dry spell likely amplified the existing political instability. It made a bad situation much, much worse.
Okay, that makes sense. Amplifying the chaos.
Yep.
Beyond drought and conflict, the sources mention other potential contributing factors too.
Yeah, they do. Rosado Ramirez is quoted suggesting that perhaps the elite class in these classic cities had just grown too large, too demanding.
Like top-heavy.
Kinda, yeah. Becoming an unwieldy burden for the common farmers to support, especially when food supplies started dwindling due to that environmental stress.
Mm-hmm.
And think about the symbolic blow. Those divine kings who claimed this divine right to rule, when they started falling so dramatically, it would have profoundly undermined the very foundation of the monarchy itself.
The justification for their rule just crumbled.
Exactly. And while tracing the specifics of that political transition archaeologically is harder than, say, seeing carved portraits of the god kings, the sources argue it was absolutely a critical factor.
So when those divine kings fell, their cities often followed quickly.
Pretty much. Without a ruler to glorify or the resources and structure provided by the court, large-scale construction of new buildings and monuments it stopped.
Okay.
This is why archaeologists can use the last dated monument at a site as a kind of marker. It's essentially the last moment we have definitive evidence of the old order functioning.
I see.
And while there are grim exceptions like that mass grave found at Cancun showing some nobility were indeed killed.
Right, you mentioned that.
In most places, the elite seem to have simply left when their power base dissolved and their justification for rule just vanished. They moved on.
And with the elite gone, I guess the priests, the artists, everyone connected to the court and the central power structure probably followed them.
Often, yeah. They moved to places with better prospects. Merchants also relocated to find new, more viable markets.
Makes sense.
The commoners, who were primarily farmers tied to their household fields, were likely the last to abandon the old cities. They probably held out as long as they could. But eventually, for most people, the old urban centers became unsustainable and they just, fell into ruin.
So back to Ake in the north. Initially, they felt a bit shielded from all this chaos.
It seems so, yeah. Distance offered some protection, definitely, but also the sources point out that people in the northern Yucatan were already kind of used to dealing with water stress.
Because it's naturally drier up there.
Exactly. So Ake's residents had well-developed skills in collecting rainfall, conserving water in their reservoirs, and cenotes, those natural sinkholes. These existing strategies likely helped them weather the initial stages of the broader drought that was gripping the region.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, right? Because the strife didn't stay away forever.
None at all.
Sometime between 900 and 1000 CE, as the situation got worse elsewhere, Ake did something pretty dramatic. They built a massive wall.
A huge wall, yeah.
And this wasn't just around the edge of the city, was it? It enclosed only the city center, the temples and palaces.
Right, the core.
And it literally cut across that 20-mile limestone road, the Sac Bay, that connected Ake to another major center, Izamal. That seems huge, physically and symbolically isolating Ake's core.
It's a massive statement. The sources suggest potential reasons for this. Was it built to protect against attacks from the rising power of the Itza people at nearby Chichen Itza?
A rival power.
Possibly. Or was it maybe to control the flow of refugees? People fleeing the collapsing southern cities, desperate for food and water in a region already struggling to feed its own population?
Controlling immigration. That sounds familiar.
It does, doesn't it? Even with that wall, though, Ake, remarkably, remained a flourishing city right through the 10th century. They were adapting to the shifting political landscape. But just like people experiencing the impacts of climate change originating far away today, the problem eventually arrived directly at their doorstep.
The big one.
The big one. An even more severe and prolonged drought struck the northern Yucatan between 1000 and 1100 CE. This one was different. It overwhelmed even the northern cities' sophisticated water management systems.
Even their expertise couldn't handle it.
Apparently not. By the end of the 1100s, Ake and other major northern cities had also collapsed and were largely abandoned. At least, abandoned in their classic form. As we saw before, the elites, the ruling class, they were the first to leave when their system of power became untenable.
And most of their subjects dispersed after them.
Pretty much, yeah. In the immediate aftermath across the broader Maya world, the sources describe these profound changes. Old regional identities, political territories, they just dissolved. Monumental architecture and the massive labor needed to build it declined dramatically.
No.
The elaborate ancient trade routes disintegrated or maybe reformed in much weaker versions. And critically, scribes and sculptors largely stopped carving significant dates into stone monuments.
Which was such a hallmark of classic Maya civilization.
Absolutely. The sources note that the sudden lack of these dated inscriptions gives archaeologists this rather eerie impression that Maya history somehow just stopped.
UT. And this is such a key point the sources make. History absolutely did not stop, did it?
Not at all. Most Maya people didn't vanish into thin air. They moved. Often they moved to smaller villages, many relocating towards the coast where resources might have been more accessible, maybe easier to get.
Right.
The challenge for archaeologists, though, as the sources explain, is that their new homes were typically made of perishable materials, thatched roofs, wooden walls.
Stuff that just doesn't last.
Exactly. They simply don't survive in the archaeological record the way stone pyramids do. So past generations of archaeologists looking only for those grand stone cities often completely missed this post-classic period. Or they just didn't look for it because they were operating under the assumption that nothing significant happened after the classic collapse.
Thinking the story was over.
Pretty much. Which brings us back to Ake and really challenges that old simplistic view of complete abandonment. Rosado Ramirez, having spent years working closely with the modern inhabitants of Ake, just felt in his gut that the idea of total abandonment after the classic period didn't quite make sense.
He had a hunch.
Yeah, and he used this powerful analogy. He realized if an archaeologist only looked at the crumbling remains of the old henequen factory in modern Ake.
Like the sisal processing plant.
Right. They might conclude the entire town was abandoned decades ago, which is clearly not the case today, with people still living right there.
That's a great point. So he started looking at ancient Ake through that modern lens.
Exactly. He wondered, what if people had stayed, just in a different way? And crucially, he didn't do this alone. He formed this critical collaboration with Vicente Cucon Lopez, a local resident who was also a close friend.
Ah, the local connection.
Yeah, and Cucon Lopez knew the ancient site intimately, having grown up right around it. He had an incredible eye for spotting subtle variations in building patterns, details that academic archaeologists might easily miss.
That local knowledge is invaluable. The story of their collaboration sounds pretty inspiring, too.
It really is. The sources detail how Rosado Ramirez started this work without grants or formal funding, just trekking out to Ake every Saturday.
Wow, dedication.
Totally. And Cucon Lopez would spend time during the week scouting the site, sometimes following old metal tracks laid during the henequen boom, and even drawing rough maps to guide their weekend explorations.
That's amazing teamwork.
The source emphasizes that Cucon Lopez could look at what others saw as just a jumble of old stones and actually see the timeline, how later people were interacting with and repurposing the monumental structures built centuries before.
Seeing the layers of history?
Precisely. They even found small structures built with a mix of the huge stones from Ake's earliest phase and smaller, later stones, direct physical evidence of continuity and reuse.
Wow. So what did they find?
Well, with Cucon Lopez and his local team's help, Rosado Ramirez was able to identify the remains of 96 small, mostly residential structures built within the monumental core of old Ake.
96 houses inside the old center.
Yep. They excavated 18 of these. These houses were typically clustered around shared patios, and they contained ceramic styles dating from 1100 to 1400 CE.
Oh.
That's well after the classic period collapse.
Okay, so people definitely stayed.
Absolutely. And what's truly surprising and deeply significant is that commoners were living right there in the central plaza, that vast open space that had been strictly reserved for elite ritual and civic functions during the classic height of the city.
Wow, commoners living in the central plaza. That's a pretty dramatic visual, isn't it? The old order completely upended. It's like they reclaimed the elite's most sacred space.
It is incredibly symbolic.
Did the sources talk about why they might have chosen to live right there among the ruins of the palaces and temples? Was it purely practical, or did it carry other meaning?
The shift is huge, isn't it? The sources suggest a couple of practical reasons. Perhaps it was for protection, living inside the old city wall during what was still a politically unstable time in the broader region.
Safety in numbers, inside the walls.
Could be. Or maybe they simply found the old city border, defined by that wall, a convenient way to define and unify their new, much smaller community.
Using the old boundaries for a new purpose.
Possibly. Regardless of the precise motivation, Rosado Ramirez's estimates, based on these findings, are that between 170 and 380 people continued living among the ruins of Ake during this post-classic period.
And that number, you said, is remarkably close to the modern population of the town today.
Yeah, it's quite striking. These findings paint a picture of a post-classic lifestyle that lasted over 400 years.
4 centuries.
Yeah. Smaller, more localized communities, a more egalitarian social structure, greater flexibility, and ultimately greater resilience.
And critically.
Critically, the sources stress that these people never again agreed to be ruled by a divine king.
Never again. They learned their lesson.
It seems so. They had experienced firsthand how that ultra-stratified, rigid system, centered around a god king and a large elite, had failed them catastrophically when faced with environmental and political stress. It made their cities vulnerable, their whole system fragile. The sources posed this simple, powerful question. Why would they repeat a system that had led to such disaster?
Yeah, why would you? So instead, starting around 1100 CE, the Maya of the northern Yucatan built a completely different kind of capital, Mayapan.
That's right. And this wasn't designed as the seat of a single god king with a divine mandate. The sources describe it more as a meeting place, the center of a confederacy composed of representatives from various different communities.
A council, almost.
Kind of, yeah. Comparing Mayapan to the classic cities is very revealing. Like Ake in its later phase, Mayapan had a city wall, but its enclosed center was densely occupied by both monumental buildings and commoner homes, all mixed together.
No strict separation like before.
Nope. It had pyramids, yes, but no single vast central plaza designed for a god king's grand pronouncements. Political discussions and decisions happened within the compounds of the powerful constituencies represented on the council.
More decentralized power.
Seems like it. Religion also seems to have become more personal, with a greater emphasis on home altars rather than solely large public temples. And the architecture itself changed. It used smaller, easier-to-work stones, less refined than the classic period, maybe, but still imposing and functional.
And scribes shifted from carving history in stone to writing in more portable books. Bark paper.
Exactly, a different way of recording things.
Interestingly, though, Mayapan itself didn't last forever either, did it?
No, it didn't. It was hit by yet another major drought around 1400 CE and was largely abandoned by 1441.
Another drought casualty.
Yeah. And the lesson from Mayapan, according to the sources, is that even a system based on shared, centralized power could ultimately succumb when faced with a major, prolonged environmental challenge. It kind of reinforces the idea that perhaps the flexibility and adaptability of smaller, more localized communities was ultimately the most resilient strategy.
Like the people back in post-classic Ake.
Exactly. Those people living in post-classic Ake in their smaller, less hierarchical community, they were already living in that safer, more adaptable way during this later drought. They had already undergone their major transformation after the earlier collapse. They didn't need to abandon their homes or completely remake their lives again when Mayapan fell.
They'd already figured it out.
They had already rebuilt and reimagined their communities, carrying forward what worked and leaving behind what didn't.
So pulling all of this together then, what does this deeper dive into the sources really mean for us? The author's perspective seems to be that studying these sites, seeing the whole story, the collapse and the sustained creative transformation that followed, is incredibly valuable for us today.
Yeah, especially as we navigate our own challenging times.
Definitely.
And what's truly fascinating, and I think offers a lot of hope, is seeing how the Maya reinvented themselves. They weren't just passive victims who vanished, they actively learned from their catastrophic failure. They made conscious choices about what to keep and what to leave behind from their old world.
And one of the biggest things they left behind was,
That system of divine kingship and the extreme inequality it fostered, they ditched it.
it really does challenge that initial terrifying perception, doesn't it? What if the classic Maya collapse isn't just the mysterious, tragic story of a people disappearing, but actually a powerful story of necessary transformation?
Yeah, born out of incredibly difficult times for sure, but ultimately leading to a more resilient way of life for centuries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When we look at sites like post-classic Ake and Mayapan, they're not just cautionary tales about the dangers of collapse.
No, they are vivid examples of human adaptation, creativity, and reinvention that happened because of the apocalypse.
It highlights the remarkable resilience of people, their capacity to learn from failure and remake their world, choosing a different path based on hard-won lessons from a broken system.
Which, raises an important question for us today. What aspects of our current society, perhaps like the Maya's absolute reliance on divine kingship and the fragility it created, might be making us vulnerable to the challenges we face? And what could we potentially learn from the way the Maya fundamentally transformed themselves after their world changed so profoundly?
A lot to consider, isn't it? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the past and its surprisingly relevant lessons for today. It really makes you think about what adaptability truly looks like right now in our own world.